The late summer sun cast long shadows across the cracked earth of the El Paso Valley as Margaret Anderson stood at her cabin door, watching dust devils dance across the barren landscape. Her calloused hands gripped the wooden doorframe, knuckles white with worry as she surveyed the withering cornstalks that represented her family's third failed harvest. The drought had shown no mercy to anyone foolish enough to try farming in this unforgiving corner of Texas, but Margaret wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. Inside the modest cabin, her husband Daniel Anderson lay fevered on their narrow bed, his skin burning with the mysterious illness that had struck him down 3 days prior. Their young daughter Laura sat beside him, dutifully replacing the damp cloth on his forehead as Margaret had shown her. At just 12 years old, Laura already carried herself with the quiet strength that life on the frontier demanded. The year was 1875, and the Anderson family had staked their claim on this patch of sun-scorched earth 2 years ago, drawn by tales of fertile soil and abundant water that had proven to be nothing more than desert mirages. Now they found themselves caught between the unrelenting elements and the increasing tensions between settlers and the Comanche bands that still called these lands home. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the east. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle propped beside the door, but she relaxed slightly upon recognizing Frank Clark's weather-beaten hat bobbing along the horizon. The aging shopkeeper from El Paso made his monthly rounds to the outlying homesteads, bringing supplies and, more importantly, news from town. "Mrs. Anderson," Frank called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the gravelly quality of someone who'd spent too many years breathing desert dust. "Brought them medicines you asked for, though Doc Walker says he ain't sure they'll do much good without knowing what's ailing your Daniel." He pulled several small glass bottles from his saddlebags, their contents gleaming amber in the fading light. As Margaret counted out precious coins to pay for the medicine, Frank shared the latest rumors spreading through El Paso. Comanche hunting parties had been spotted closer to town than usual, likely pushed from their traditional grounds by drought and the endless expansion of settler territories. But it was his mention of a mysterious Comanche healer that caught Margaret's attention. Supposedly, this medicine man possessed knowledge of cures unknown to white doctors. That evening, after Laura had fallen asleep and Daniel's fever finally broke into fitful rest, Margaret sat at their rough-hewn table studying an old map by lamplight. The Comanche camps were said to lie 3 days' ride to the north, in territory few settlers dared to venture. The sensible choice would be to stay put and pray that conventional medicines would save her husband. But Margaret Anderson had not survived 2 years on the frontier by always making the sensible choice. Dawn found Margaret preparing for a journey she knew might prove fatal. She packed dried meat, hard biscuits, and precious water into her saddlebags, along with a small collection of trading goods, silver jewelry passed down from her mother, colorful fabric squares, and tobacco. She had heard that the Comanche valued fair trade more than they trusted empty-handed settlers bearing promises. Robert Taylor, their nearest neighbor whose homestead lay a mile to the west, agreed to look in on Daniel and Laura during Margaret's absence, though he clearly thought her mission foolhardy at best and suicidal at worst. The gruff widower understood the desperate measures that love sometimes demanded. His own wife Martha had succumbed to fever the previous winter, with no doctor within 50 miles to help her. As Margaret mounted her horse and took one last look at her sleeping family through the cabin window, she whispered a prayer to whatever powers might be listening in this harsh land. The rising sun painted the desert in shades of purple and gold, and somewhere in the vast expanse ahead lay either salvation or doom. With a gentle kick to her horse's flanks, Margaret Anderson rode north, leaving behind everything she knew in search of hope among strangers. The first day's ride proved grueling as Margaret pushed north through increasingly rugged terrain. The desert's beauty held deadly teeth. Every rustle in the scrub brush could be a rattler, every distant shadow a mountain lion. She rationed her water carefully, knowing the next reliable spring was still a day's ride ahead, according to the crude map Robert had sketched for her. As dusk approached, Margaret spotted an abandoned adobe structure tucked against a red rock outcropping. Though wary of ambush, she needed shelter from the wind that had begun to whip stinging sand across the desert floor. After carefully circling the building and finding no fresh tracks, she led her horse inside. The roof remained mostly intact, and the thick walls offered blessed relief from the elements. Sleep proved elusive that night as Margaret's mind wandered to Daniel and Laura. She had left enough prepared food for several days, but Daniel's fever weighed heavily on her conscience. The medicine she sought seemed an impossible dream now, alone in the vastness with only the mournful cries of coyotes for company. She clutched the pouch of trading goods close, taking comfort in the familiar scent of tobacco leaves. Dawn brought a welcome change in the weather as high clouds tempered the sun's assault. Margaret discovered tracks in the sand. Several horses had passed nearby heading northwest while she slept. The hoofprints were fresh, no more than a few hours old. Her heart raced at the implications. These could be the very people she sought, or they could be raiders who would show no mercy to a lone woman. After careful consideration, Margaret chose to follow the tracks at a distance. The Comanche were known to range this territory, and even if these weren't the band she sought, they might lead her to others who could help. She kept to high ground when possible, scanning the horizon for dust clouds that would betray larger groups of riders. By midday, she caught sight of thin smoke rising from a sheltered canyon. Margaret dismounted and crept forward on foot until she could make out a small camp below. 3 riders tended horses while 2 others crouched by a small fire. Their dress and gear marked them as Comanche, but without knowing their band or intentions, approaching them meant risking everything. As she weighed her options, a child's laughter echoed up from the canyon. Margaret's maternal instincts stirred at the sound, so like Laura's giggle. Then she saw the source. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, chasing a butterfly near the creek that wound through the canyon floor. The scene's peaceful domesticity gave Margaret courage. These were families, not raiders. Still, she took no chances. Margaret returned to her horse and approached the canyon's mouth openly, making no attempt at stealth. She kept her hands visible and her expression calm despite her pounding heart. The camp fell silent as she came into view, but no weapons were raised. An older woman emerged from a shelter, carrying herself with unmistakable authority. The woman spoke a few sharp words, and a young man stepped forward. To Margaret's relief, he addressed her in halting but understandable English. "Why you come here alone?" Margaret slowly reached for her tobacco pouch, keeping her movements deliberate. "I seek the healer called Many Dreams," she replied, using the name Robert had told her. "My son is sick with fever. I bring trade goods and ask for medicine." The translator conferred briefly with the older woman, whose keen eyes studied Margaret with unsettling intensity. Finally, he turned back. "Many Dreams is not here, but grandmother says she knows where to find her. 3 days north, near the sacred springs." He pointed to Margaret's tobacco pouch. "Show what you bring for trade. We may help you find the way." Margaret carefully emptied her trade pouch onto a woven blanket the young translator had spread before her. The items caught the harsh desert sunlight: strips of cotton cloth, steel needles, dried herbs from her garden, and the precious tobacco. Her fingers trembled slightly as she arranged them, aware of the scrutinizing gazes of the Comanche women who had gathered in a loose circle around her. The older woman, the one they called grandmother, knelt to examine each item with methodical care. The dry wind whipped Margaret's skirts around her ankles as she waited, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. In the distance, horses nickered softly, and children's voices drifted on the breeze. She thought of her own child, Henry, lying fevered in their cabin near Cheyenne, with only Martha watching over him. The guilt of leaving him, even to seek help, gnawed at her conscience. But after 3 days of his worsening condition, she'd had no choice but to seek out the legendary healer Robert had told her about. Grandmother spoke at length to the translator, her weathered hands gesturing toward the northern hills that shimmed like copper in the afternoon light. The young man nodded repeatedly before turning to Margaret. "Grandmother says your goods are acceptable. She will send 2 hawks with you as guide." He pointed to a lean young warrior who stood apart from the group, his face impassive. "But she warns, the path to Many Dreams is not easy. The springs lie in contested land. Other tribes hunt there, and white settlers push closer each season." Margaret's throat tightened at the mention of dangers, but she forced herself to nod calmly. "How long will the journey take?" she asked, already calculating the precious hours that would pass before she could return to Henry. The translator conferred again with grandmother, whose dark eyes seemed to peer straight through Margaret's careful composure to the fear beneath. 3 days to reach the springs if the weather holds," he replied. "But Many Dreams moves with the seasons. She may be difficult to find, even there. Grandmother says she will give you a token. Something to show you come with Comanche blessing. Without it, many dreams may not speak with you at all. The late summer sun beat mercilessly upon Margaret Anderson's homestead as she studied the strange seeds in her palm, their iridescent shells gleaming like tiny pearls. 2 weeks had passed since she'd rescued the Comanche healer's daughter from a band of horse thieves outside El Paso, and the mysterious gift still filled her with equal parts wonder and unease. Her husband Henry had warned her about planting anything given by the natives, but the drought had left them desperate, their wheat fields cracking and barren. Rachel Clark, Margaret's closest neighbor and confidant, rode up on her dappled mare just as Margaret was preparing to plant the first row. The two women had formed an unlikely friendship after both losing children to fever the previous winter. Rachel's eyes widened at the sight of the peculiar seeds. "Those ain't like any I've ever seen," she remarked, dismounting to get a closer look. "Where did you get such things?" Margaret hesitated before sharing the full story of the rescue, how she'd found the young Comanche girl half dead from thirst and hidden her in the root cellar while the thieves searched the property. The girl's father, a respected medicine man, had pressed the seeds into Margaret's hands as payment, speaking in broken English about their power to flourish in the harshest conditions. "He said they've been passed down through generations of his people," Margaret explained. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Frank Moore, the newly appointed Marshal of El Paso, rode up with his deputy Charlie Taylor close behind. Moore's weathered face bore an expression of barely concealed disdain as he surveyed Margaret's property. The Marshal had made no secret of his hatred for anyone who showed kindness to the native tribes, viewing them all as savages to be driven from the territory. "Mrs. Anderson," Moore called out, not bothering to dismount, "word is you've been harboring Indians on your land. That's a serious offense in these parts." His hand rested casually on his holstered revolver, a gesture that made Margaret's blood run cold. She felt Rachel's fingers grip her arm in warning, but held her ground. "I harbor no one, Marshal. This is my property, and I'll thank you to state your business or move along." The tension stretched like a bowstring as Moore's dark eyes locked with Margaret's. Charlie Taylor shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, clearly unhappy with his superior's intimidation tactics. Finally, Moore spat in the dust and turned his horse. "Consider this a friendly warning, Mrs. Anderson. There's them that don't take kindly to Indian sympathizers." The threat in his voice was unmistakable as he and Taylor rode away. That evening, Henry Anderson returned from trading in El Paso with troubling news. Robert Walker, the town's most influential merchant, was spreading rumors about Margaret's encounter with the Comanche. Walker's own daughter Martha had disappeared 3 years prior, presumably taken by raiders, and he'd since devoted himself to turning the townspeople against any peaceful coexistence with the native tribes. Margaret spent a sleepless night watching the strange seeds she'd planted, their outline barely visible in the moonlight. Near dawn, she gasped as tiny shoots emerged from the dusty soil, their leaves an impossible shade of blue-green. By sunrise, the plants had grown to knee-height, defying every natural law she knew. Henry stood speechless beside her, watching as their withered fields slowly came alive with the otherworldly crop. Word of the miracle plant spread quickly through the territory. Rachel arrived with news that Walker had assembled a group of men, including Marshal Moore, who planned to burn the Andersons' fields, claiming the crops were some form of Indian witchcraft. But it was Moore's deputy, Charlie Taylor, who rode out ahead of the mob to warn Margaret, having witnessed firsthand the devastating effects of the drought on local families. As the sun set that evening, Margaret could see torches approaching in the distance. She thought of the Comanche healer's daughter, how the girl's eyes had filled with tears of gratitude when Margaret shared her meager supplies and tended her wounds. The seeds had been a gift of life, meant to bridge the divide between two peoples. Now she would have to defend that bridge, no matter the cost. Margaret stood on her porch, rifle in hand, as the line of torches drew closer through the twilight. Henry positioned himself beside her, his weathered hands gripping his own weapon. The approaching mob's horses kicked up dust that caught the last rays of sunlight, creating an eerie red haze that matched the menace of their intent. She could make out Marshal Moore's distinctive silhouette leading the group, his badge catching occasional glints of firelight. Deputy Charlie Taylor emerged from behind the barn, having hidden his horse there earlier. He carried extra ammunition and wore a determined expression that told Margaret he intended to stand with them. "There's 15 men out there," he whispered. including Frank Walker and some of his ranch hands. They've been drinking, which makes them more dangerous. The mysterious crops swayed in the evening breeze, their silver-green leaves reflecting the approaching torchlight like rippling water. Margaret thought of the countless hours she and Henry had spent watching them grow, defying the drought that had devastated their neighbors' fields. These plants represented more than just survival. They were a bridge between two worlds, a symbol of hope in these harsh lands. Rachel appeared from the root cellar, carrying an armload of mason jars filled with a murky liquid. "Grandmother's recipe," she explained, setting them carefully on the porch. "Oil and herbs that'll burn something fierce if we need it." Her face showed the same quiet determination Margaret had seen when Rachel had helped tend the Comanche girl's wounds months ago. The riders halted 50 yards from the house. Marshal Moore's voice carried across the distance. "Margaret Anderson, by order of the territorial court, you're to cease growing these unnatural crops and destroy what's already planted. This is your only warning." The men behind him shifted restlessly, torches casting dancing shadows across their faces. Henry stepped forward, his voice steady despite his age. "These plants are saving lives, Moore. 3 families in Cheyenne already have seeds growing. The Wilsons' children aren't going hungry anymore. You really want to destroy something that's helping your own people?" His words carried weight. Henry had been respected in these parts long before Moore wore a badge. The marshal's response was cut short by movement from the eastern edge of the field. A group of riders emerged from the darkness, led by a familiar figure, the Comanche healer herself, her daughter beside her. They rode proudly without weapons, their presence alone causing several of Moore's men to back their horses away nervously. The healer dismounted gracefully, her dark eyes reflecting wisdom beyond her years. She spoke in clear English, her voice carrying across the tense silence. "These plants grew in my ancestors' gardens when the first Spanish arrived. They sustained both peoples through many droughts. Will you destroy this gift as your kind has destroyed so much else?" Margaret watched as uncertainty spread through the mob. Walker's men looked to him for direction, but even he seemed unsure now. The torches cast long shadows across the flourishing fields, making the plants seem to dance with an otherworldly energy. Deputy Taylor moved to stand between the mob and the crops, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol. Rachel stepped forward, addressing the men she'd known all her life. "We've all lost too much to this drought. Children are hungry in every town from here to Deadwood. These plants can change that. Are you so afraid of something different that you'd rather watch your families suffer?" Her words struck home. Several men lowered their torches, looking ashamed. The tension held for several more heartbeats before Marshal Moore slowly lowered his own torch. "Frank," he said quietly, "we're leaving." Walker started to protest, but Moore cut him off. "I won't be party to destroying food in times like these. Anyone who touches these fields answers to me." The authority in his voice left no room for argument. As the mob dispersed, their torches disappearing into the night like retreating fireflies, Margaret felt tears running down her cheeks. The Comanche healer approached her, taking her hands in a gesture that transcended language. Together they stood in the growing darkness, surrounded by the miracle plants that had brought them together, their shadows merging as one against the starlit desert. The following days brought whispers and sidelong glances as Margaret and the Comanche healer, who she learned was called Running Leaf, worked to expand the miraculous garden. The desert winds carried both hope and suspicion through the town, but the first green shoots breaking through the harsh soil spoke louder than any rumors. Susan, the baker's wife, was the first to approach them with tentative curiosity, carrying a loaf of fresh bread as a peace offering. "My Henry says these plants ain't natural," Susan said, watching Running Leaf demonstrate how to tend the strange seedlings. "But I reckon anything that grows food in this wasteland must be a blessing, whether we understand it or not." Margaret smiled, remembering her own initial doubts before seeing the plants flourish in soil that had rejected every other crop. Word of the garden spread faster than summer lightning. A steady stream of visitors began arriving from neighboring settlements, some traveling days through the scorching desert to witness the miracle for themselves. Daniel, a weathered rancher from near Cheyenne, arrived with his daughter Laura, her skin pale and thin from months of near starvation. The sight of the child's hollow eyes strengthened Margaret's resolve. Running Leaf's daughter, Swift Fox, recovered slowly but surely under her mother's care. The girl began teaching Laura and other local children the ancient songs that helped the plants grow stronger, their young voices rising together in harmony that knew no boundaries of race or language. Margaret Anderson clutched the small leather pouch of mysterious seeds to her chest as she watched the storm clouds gather over the barren hills outside El Paso. The drought had lasted 3 brutal months, turning the already harsh desert landscape into an unforgiving wasteland. But these seeds, gifted by the Comanche healer woman whose daughter she had saved, held the promise of life even in this desolate place. Frank Taylor, her closest neighbor living 2 miles down the dusty road, had scoffed when Margaret told him about the seed's supposed powers. "Ain't nothing gonna grow in this cursed earth," he'd declared. But Margaret had seen the truth in the old healer's eyes when she'd pressed the pouch into her hands, speaking words in her native tongue that Margaret couldn't understand but somehow felt in her bones. The wind picked up, carrying stinging particles of sand that forced Margaret to shield her eyes. Her small cabin, built by her late husband Daniel before the fever took him last winter, creaked and groaned against the growing tempest. Inside, she could hear her daughter Laura whimpering. The girl was only 6, but she already understood the precariousness of their situation. Without a successful harvest soon, they'd have to abandon their home. Rachel Clark, the healer's daughter, had been near death when Margaret found her 3 days ago, collapsed beside a dry creek bed with an infected snakebite festering on her ankle. Despite the tensions between settlers and natives, Margaret hadn't hesitated to bring the girl home and nurse her back to health. Some townsfolk had condemned her actions, but Margaret remembered Daniel's words about how the land belonged to no one and everyone. The storm broke with shocking violence, sheets of rain hammering the parched earth. Margaret rushed inside, finding Laura huddled under a quilt. Through the window, they watched as muddy rivulets formed, carrying away months of accumulated dust. The seeds seemed to pulse with warmth in Margaret's hands, as if responding to the rain's arrival. She knew this was the moment the healer had told her to wait for. Working quickly in the downpour, Margaret planted the seeds in various spots around their property, some in the rocky soil near the house, others in the sandy patch where nothing had ever grown, and a few in the small garden plot Daniel had optimistically fenced off. The rain soaked her to the bone, but she persisted until every seed found its place in the earth. By morning, the impossible had happened. Tiny green shoots had already pushed through the soil, defying natural law. Margaret stood amazed as Laura ran between the sprouting plants, counting each one with delighted squeals. The plants seemed to grow visibly, reaching toward the sun with supernatural vigor. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads, bringing the curious and the skeptical to witness the miracle. Charlie Moore, the local preacher, arrived with several concerned congregation members, warning Margaret about dealing in Indian magic. Alright. But when he saw how the plants thrived in soil that had rejected every other seed, his warnings turned to thoughtful silence. The plants produced vegetables unlike anything Margaret had seen before. Squash with golden flesh that stayed fresh for months, corn that required almost no water, beans that could be harvested again and again from the same stalk. Martha Walker, who ran the general store in El Paso, offered to buy Margaret's entire harvest at an unprecedented price. But Margaret remembered the healer's daughter's grateful eyes and knew these gifts weren't meant for profit. Instead, she shared the bounty with every struggling family in the region, teaching them the careful growing methods the healer had shown her in dreams that came in the nights after planting. As autumn approached, Margaret's homestead had become a gathering place for both settlers and Comanche. The plants continued to flourish, creating an oasis in the desert. Robert Anderson, her brother-in-law who had urged her to sell the farm after Daniel's death, arrived from Dodge City to see for himself. He found Margaret hosting a harvest celebration where former enemies shared food and stories, their children playing together among the miraculous gardens. The healer herself returned, this time walking proudly with Rachel by her side. She smiled at what Margaret had created. Not just food from magical seeds, but something far more precious. A bridge between two peoples who had seen each other only as threats before. Through signs and Margaret's growing understanding of the Comanche language, the healer revealed that the seeds would regenerate each season, but only if the knowledge and bounty continued to be shared freely. This revelation tested Margaret's resolve as wealthy ranchers from as far as Deadwood and Cheyenne arrived, offering small fortunes for exclusive rights to the seeds. But she stood firm, knowing she had been chosen as a guardian of something far more valuable than money. The seeds had transformed not just the land, but the hearts of those who worked it together, proving that the most barren soil could yield abundance when tended with compassion and shared purpose. The peace that Margaret and the Comanche healer had cultivated was tested one scorching August morning when a column of dust announced approaching riders. Frank Miller, a cattle baron from Cheyenne, led a dozen armed men toward the flourishing gardens that now stretched across what had once been barren earth. The seeds had created an oasis that drew envious eyes. But Frank's interest went beyond mere profit. He saw the gardens as a way to control the region's future. Margaret stood at her fence line, the morning sun casting long shadows as she watched the riders approach. Rachel, the healer's daughter, now practically her own child, gripped her hand tightly. Behind them, both settler and Comanche women continued harvesting the abundant crops, though their movements had grown tense and watchful. The gardens had become more than just a source of food. They were living proof that cooperation could triumph over conflict. Frank dismounted, his spurs jingling ominously as he approached. "Mrs. Margaret," he called out, removing his hat with false courtesy, "I've brought papers from the territorial office. These lands and everything growing on them now belong to the Miller Ranch Company." He extended a document bearing official-looking seals, but Margaret didn't reach for it. She had learned enough from the healer to know that true ownership came from stewardship, not papers. The confrontation drew others from the settlement. Daniel, the town's schoolteacher who had been teaching both settler and Comanche children to read, stepped forward with a ledger, documenting Margaret's original claim. But Frank's men began spreading out, their hands hovering near holstered weapons. The garden's bounty had made the settlement prosperous enough to attract predators of a different kind. In that tense moment, a haunting melody drifted across the gardens. The Comanche healer had begun a song, her voice carrying ancient power that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Other voices joined, first Rachel, then Margaret, then the women in the gardens, both settler and native. The song spoke of roots reaching deep, of seasons turning, of life persisting despite all attempts to contain or control it. Frank's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles as the song continued. The gardens themselves seemed to respond, a subtle wind rustling through crops that stood impossibly tall and healthy in the desert soil. This was magic beyond papers and guns, beyond the greed that had driven men to steal and kill across the frontier. This was the power of earth and sky, of hands working together, of knowledge passed from mother to daughter across generations. "Your papers have no power here," Margaret declared, her voice steady. "These gardens grow from seeds of trust between peoples. Every harvest is shared, every season brings new growth, and no man's greed can change that." As she spoke, more riders appeared on the horizon. But these were Comanche warriors, led by the healer's people, coming not to fight, but to stand witness to the truth of Margaret's words. Frank found himself surrounded not by victims he could intimidate, but by a community united in purpose. His men, sensing the shift in power, began backing their horses away. The cattle baron made one final threat about returning with the law, but his words scattered like dust in the wind that still carried echoes of the women's song. He had come expecting to find a simple farming operation he could overpower. Instead, he had encountered something that transcended the very notion of ownership. As Frank and his men rode away, Margaret and Rachel embraced the healer. The garden's bounty had protected itself by proving its true purpose, not as a source of wealth or power, but as a bridge between cultures, a living testament to what could grow when ancient wisdom met open hearts. The seeds' magic lay not just in their ability to flourish in any soil, but in their power to transform those who tended them with respect and understanding. That evening, as the sun painted the desert sky in impossible colors, Margaret watched children from both communities playing among the garden rows. The healer had taught her that the seed's greatest gift wasn't the food they provided, but the way they revealed the truth about abundance, that it multiplied when shared, that it grew strongest in the spaces between differences, that it flourished best in soil nourished by cooperation rather than competition. Margaret Anderson stared in wonder at the small leather pouch of seeds Singing Bird had pressed into her hands. The elderly Comanche healer's eyes sparkled with gratitude as she explained through gestures that these sacred seeds would grow anywhere, even in the harshest desert soil around their homestead outside El Paso. It seemed impossible, But after saving the healer's young daughter from a rattlesnake bite, Margaret knew there were mysteries in this land that defied explanation. The autumn wind whipped dust across the yard as Margaret walked back to her modest adobe home, her mind racing with possibilities. Her husband Daniel had always dreamed of creating a thriving farm in this unforgiving landscape, but year after year the parched earth had yielded little more than heartache. These seeds, if they truly held the power Singing Bird claimed, could change everything for their family's future. Inside, she found Daniel teaching their son Charlie how to clean his father's old rifle. At 10 years old, Charlie was already showing the same determined spirit that had driven Daniel to stake their claim in this harsh territory. Margaret carefully set the leather pouch on the rough-hewn table, explaining her encounter with the Comanche healer and her daughter. Daniel's weathered face creased with skepticism, but hope flickered in his tired eyes. That evening, as the desert sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Margaret and Daniel walked their property together. The land that had once seemed full of promise now lay barren and cracked, beaten down by years of drought. But Margaret felt a stirring of excitement as she scattered a handful of the mysterious seeds into a small plot she had cleared. Daniel squeezed her hand, and for the first time in years, they allowed themselves to dream again. Days passed, and Margaret tended the planted seeds with reverent care. To her amazement, tiny green shoots began to emerge from the dusty soil, sturdy plants unlike anything she had seen before. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads, and soon their neighbors were appearing at the Andersons' door, drawn by rumors of the miracle garden flourishing in the desert. Among the visitors was Frank Taylor, a bitter man who had lost his own farm to drought the previous year. His eyes burned with barely concealed resentment as he watched Margaret's garden thrive. That night, Daniel caught Frank trying to steal some of the precious seeds. Instead of responding with anger, Margaret surprised everyone by offering to share the seeds, along with the knowledge Singing Bird had given her about tending them properly. The simple act of generosity transformed their small community. Other families began successfully growing crops from the gifted seeds, and soon the once desolate valley was dotted with patches of green. Margaret often thought of Singing Bird and her daughter, knowing that this blessing had come from an act of kindness between two mothers from very different worlds. As spring turned to summer, Margaret's garden flourished beyond her wildest dreams. The plants proved hardy and abundant, providing food not only for their family but enough to share with neighbors in need. Even Frank Taylor's pride eventually softened, and he became one of their strongest allies in building a community where both settlers and native people could find common ground. Charlie grew alongside the garden, learning from both his parents and their Comanche neighbors about the delicate balance between taking from the land and giving back to it. The boy, who had once been fascinated only with his father's rifle, now spent hours helping his mother tend the mysterious plants, asking endless questions about their origin and care. One crisp morning, Margaret spotted Singing Bird and her daughter watching from the ridge above their homestead. The healer raised her hand in greeting, and Margaret understood that this had been her plan all along, not just to reward a kindness, but to plant seeds of a different kind. Seeds of understanding and cooperation that would grow as surely as the ones transforming the valley below. Years passed, and the Anderson homestead became known as a place where all were welcome. The garden continued to thrive, its abundance a living testament to the power of unexpected friendships and shared knowledge. Margaret kept a small leather pouch of the original seeds always close to her heart, a reminder that the most precious gifts often come wrapped in the simplest packages. When Charlie grew old enough to take over the farm, he maintained the traditions his mother had established. The seeds were freely shared with any who showed respect for their origin and purpose. The story of how they came to the Anderson family was passed down through generations, a reminder that the truest measure of wealth lies not in what we keep for ourselves, but in what we share with others. Margaret lived to see her great-grandchildren playing in the shade of trees grown from those first precious seeds. In her final days, she would sit in her garden, surrounded by the legacy of that long-ago act of kindness. The desert wind still blew, but now it carried the sweet scent of growing things and the promise of continued abundance for all who called this valley home. As the years passed, the Anderson farm became a living testament to Margaret's legacy. The descendants who tended the miraculous seeds noticed something remarkable. Each generation of plants seemed to adapt and grow stronger, as if the very essence of the desert herself had merged with the Comanche healer's ancient wisdom. Charlie's daughter Rachel took special interest in documenting the varieties that emerged, filling leather-bound journals with careful observations and pressed specimens. The farm's reputation spread beyond the valley, drawing visitors from as far as Cheyenne and Deadwood who sought not just the seeds, but the story behind them. Rachel welcomed them all with the same grace her grandmother had shown, sharing both seeds and knowledge freely. She understood that the true power of their family's gift lay not in the plants themselves, but in the bridges they built between people. One particularly harsh summer, when drought threatened the surrounding region, the Anderson farm stood as an oasis of green. Neighboring ranchers who had once scoffed at Margaret's tales of magical seeds now came seeking help. Rachel remembered her grandmother's teachings about generosity and organized a community effort to share their bounty and knowledge. The seeds that had once saved a single family now helped sustain an entire community. During this time, an elderly Comanche woman arrived at the farm, introducing herself as the granddaughter of the healer who had given Margaret the original seeds. She carried with her additional knowledge about the plant's properties that had been lost to time. Through tears of joy, she explained how her grandmother had often spoken of the kind settler woman who had saved her daughter, and how the seeds had been a gift meant to bridge two worlds. The reunion led to a deeper understanding of the seeds' care. The Comanche woman, who called herself Martha to accommodate her new friends, stayed through the harvest season, teaching Rachel's children the sacred songs and rituals that helped the plants thrive. These ancient practices, combined with modern farming techniques, created an even more robust crop. In time, universities in El Paso and beyond sent researchers to study the unique properties of the Anderson farm's vegetation. Rachel insisted that any scientific papers published must acknowledge both the Comanche origins of the seeds and Margaret's role in preserving them. The family's story became part of the permanent record, a testament to the power of compassion and cultural exchange. As Rachel aged, she watched her own children and grandchildren continue the tradition of stewardship. Her son Daniel proved particularly adept at cultivating new varieties, creating drought-resistant strains that could flourish even in the harshest conditions. The farm expanded its mission, becoming a living laboratory where traditional wisdom and modern science worked in harmony. The original leather pouch of seeds, now brittle with age but still containing a few of the first specimens, was preserved in a special glass case in the farmhouse. Beside it hung Margaret's faded journal, its pages telling the story of that fateful day when an act of kindness changed not just one family's destiny, but the very landscape of the desert frontier. Each spring, when the first shoots pushed through the soil, the Anderson family would gather to celebrate what they called Margaret's Day. They would share meals with neighbors, distribute seeds to those in need, and retell the story of how their legacy began. The desert wind that had once carried only dust now danced through fields of green, carrying the whispered thanks of generations who had benefited from one woman's compassion and another's gratitude. The farm became more than just a place. It transformed into a living symbol of hope and reconciliation. Native American families would often stop by during their travels, sharing their own agricultural wisdom and receiving seeds in return. The Anderson family honored these exchanges, understanding that their gift carried responsibilities that transcended cultural boundaries. As the 20th century approached, the Anderson farm stood as a reminder that the truest frontiers were not those of land or territory, but of the human heart. The seeds that had once seemed magical revealed their real power, the ability to bring people together, to heal old wounds, and to prove that, even in the harshest desert, with faith and understanding, life would always find a way to flourish.